I get that.
Yeah.
That's what
That's basically what we had to do. A lot of the cities and counties are kind of old school, so some information they don't have. Go and just go down and back then they tell you to go down and sit. Yeah, it's interesting. And then too, another thing. Whenever you choose it's easy to go through it, but it
So if any of us write in this chat,
make it manageable. That's what versus though, because I'm sure that there's some sort of big story behind already. I worked out some sideline issues on whenever I calculated on that versus jurisdictional, it was like you kind of might have learned and you had some prospects.
So yours though.
Oh yeah.
So I'm talking about like
by the way, they thought I dropped the class. The professor was like, I didn't respond to anything, I didn't sign up for the exams, nothing. And I had one day to go through all 17 of those videos. I spent a full day, didn't sleep, listening to that guy. No.
I didn't see the first half of the line goes to guys. I listened to 1.5.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
The second part though, the second section, like for the final, dude, I watched like 3 and I was like, I'm done.
Yeah, I didn't watch that many. The best part is like, as I everyone's from the line and see this email, I'm like, oh wow, I thought I'm the 1st in the class.
Dude, I love that. I honestly, I learned a lot. Construction like really gets me in. Well, dude, if you listen to me talk for 20 hours, you'd hate me too. He did a good job for where he was, for being an illustration. Yeah.
So it might be able to do that. They might be special zoning.
Oh yeah, I was a career. Yeah, I was a career. Honduras. All right.
Like what time?
Yeah, I ain't like it. I was 6 years, I didn't like it. Then I was 6 years in, I was doing well. So I was like, alright, I might as well just yeah, I did a year. I got football for a year. Yeah, man.
Let's get started. All right. The basis and the origins of land use control. If you've done your reading, you have some familiarity with this. These are some of the basic questions. If you think about it, if you study, ancient history and the feudal system in Europe, right? There was a lord who owned the land, and there were lots of people pressed into service to farm the land for the lord, but it all went back to him. It was really the king, and ultimately above the feudal lord was a king. The king owned everything, and so the premise that we got into real estate law in the United States, brought over from the common law of England, was yes, land ownership gives you rights to use the land, but it's always subject to the king. And that ability of the overall government to take back from you, the landowner, some of what you can do with your land has always been present in our law historically. So we're not talking about somebody taking your land right now, but we're talking about regulating it and restricting the use of it. And from the reading, from those of you who had a chance to do the reading, any memory of what is the source of land use law? What governmental basis?
Commerce Clause?
The Commerce Clause is the provision of the Constitution that allows the federal government to impose requirements on the states. Does anybody else?
Nuisance or?
That was the origin. Yeah, that was the original origin of land use control. And so we'll get into that. So what does it mean to own land? Does it, some of the questions, is it just the surface of the land?
No. Air rights.
Air? Anything else?
Yeah.
Riparian rights? Riparian rights if you're adjacent to water, to a water body, especially a natural water body that gives you some rights in the water.
Mitigation issues.
Well, let's not get there yet. Now we're changing the land. Okay, we're just talking for a few minutes about the land itself. To own land, so we think that gives you control of the surface of the land, the air above the land, the minerals, the earth beneath the surface, some access undefined as to an adjacent water body called a riparian right. You've got something there. So that's the premise. That's a pretty broad right to have. That's our real estate, our real property professors used to call it a bundle of sticks. The right to own land, you got a bundle of sticks, and different things can pull out bundles, pull things out. If that complete control of the land, air, surface, ground, minerals, mining, adjacent recreation, if that's what we start from, who should have, should that be full enjoyment of land? Should that be presumed for everyone? When you buy a piece of land, you buy it all?
No, probably. Probably.
Not in the deed? Because it's not, if it's not in the deed, is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
it's not specified in the deed where, like, what you get when you purchase the land.
Oh, restrictions.
Okay, so you think there shouldn't be, I mean, we're
You
just,
can purchase the land and not have rights to the.
and not have some of those other rights, if the deed says so.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, okay. If it's not in the deed, okay, it's just a warranty deed for fee, what's called fee title, that's the most complete we can buy in the land. If it's not in the deed, should there be any limitations on the use of the land? We're just talking theoretically.
Yes, like a developer who had left parcels without certain restrictions. But the court ruled that based on the general use, he should have been aware that they would have been unusable. You know, where he was trying to use certain parcels that were left without that restrictions in a subdivision. And they ruled, no, you couldn't just go use it for other changes zoning on it, because it was implied within that planned community that had the other restrictions that they couldn't just use it. So yes,
Okay, so someone should be able to limit the use of the land.
Yeah.
And maybe the neighbors, maybe the similar uses should have an impact on what's permitted on someone's land.
Yes.
That's kind of hard to quantify, hard to evaluate before you buy your land, right? It's an understanding of what your neighbors might want you to do with the land. Would you buy land if the person who was going to decide your use was a neighbor that you didn't know?
No.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe the person who's going to control, who's going to limit the use of the land, we don't want it simply to be private parties. By whom, for what purpose? If I really like blue houses, and I don't want anything other than blue houses around me, do you think that that interest of mine should control what my neighbor does with my land? I really only want blue houses. You can't build it if it's not blue. That makes sense? No? So those kind of private interests might not be the best way for land development to proceed, because it's individualized. I mean, you can see all of the problems with that. And what's the joke that about land, that why is it always valuable? Because they're not making any more. So a community is made up of the land within its boundaries, and it can be redeveloped, but that's what they have to work with. So you can't be casual really about how you build, how you develop. Should a landowner, who's got familiarity with the term highest and best use? It's a term used in appraisal, right? Primarily. And should a landowner always be entitled to achieve the highest and best use of the land?
Not absolute.
If it's reasonable.
Not absolute, should be reasonable? Okay, we're still talking about who gets to decide what's reasonable in the regulation of land. But there's generally a consensus. You would want to live in a community where there was some reasonable land use control, right? Okay. So we start from a position of, I own my land, I can do anything with it I want, and it becomes subject to control. I could be controlled by my neighbors. They have the most immediate interest in what I do with my land, but they're not necessarily going to be reasonable, and they're not going to take the community's interests in mind. So maybe that's not the best way. Some of the reading I had you do talked about that early aspect, and it was called nuisance law. Nuisance is a tort, which means it's a private right of action against someone else for a harm. A slip and fall lawsuit is a tort action. Somebody did something negligent and they caused harm to someone else, and they want to sue for damages. So nuisance is like that, but it has to do with something like what you do on your land. If someone starts a pig farm, has a pig farm next to a high-end, residential property, you would say the pig farm is a nuisance because of the odors and the hazardous material that it generates. It's just not compatible with the residential use. So that was the earliest form of land use control. Someone would sue their neighbor for nuisance. The brick, was it Haddachak? Was that the brickyard, right? But it wasn't a complete, it has some appeal because it allows the marketplace to determine what will be built. And in the United States, in our economic system, we really like that. We like the market to determine how business is going to proceed because they become self-sustaining that way. It's not being regulated by the government. But nuisance law led to individualized decisions that didn't necessarily carry over. They certainly had no legal effect on the next decision to come down the pike. And they had no real practical application. How you resolve a conflict between a brickyard and a neighborhood is not really going to help you resolve the conflict between the tall tower and the short building, or the conflict between the industrial use and the residential use. The determination of one of those disputes doesn't carry over and help you resolve the next dispute. So nuisance law was not really adequate to address the regulation of land. So from the starting point of I can do anything I want with my land as long as it's not a nuisance and my neighbor doesn't sue me, let's go over to the other end of that spectrum, is the law of eminent domain or condemnation. The government says, I can buy your land. So you get to do everything with your land, or the government says, I'm going to take your land and you don't get it at all. That's the other end of this spectrum. And again, this ancient common law that came in when our country was formed from England, it had this right of eminent domain. The king, the government, can take land for public purpose. But our Constitution says they have to pay for it. At least we have that. Another aspect of this is regulatory takings. We will spend time on this. I'm not going to spend too much time here. Some of the cases you'll read have to do with regulatory takings. So the government can take your land. They can say, we need that land for that road. We're going to buy it. We're going to force you to sell it to us. We're going to pay you for it, but you really have no choice about the matter. And in between these two spectrums is regulation. And regulation has constraints. If regulation becomes so burdensome that there's no economically viable use of the land left, it becomes a regulatory taking. So the government didn't step in and say, I'm taking the land, but they said, I'm regulating it so heavily that in reality you have no land left. And that's actionable. That's a lawsuit that you can win. And again, these are all things that are on a spectrum. One end you can do anything, the other end the government's going to take your land. Yeah.
So eminent domain, that is both, like you said, the example back in time where they could just physically take it, or both currently where we have to actually pay for land? Does that cover both, or is it just?
It had its origins in ancient law where the king could take what he wanted, but in our law, since the Constitution, under our Constitution, it always requires compensation.
So it's still considered?
It's still eminent domain, and it's still condemnation. Those are
There's synonyms to that too, like I lived in Canada for a while, they call that expropriation.
Sure, yeah, I keep up with some Canadian law concepts because I have some clients up there, so. Yep, it's the same idea, but usually in American law you'll find it described as eminent domain or condemnation. And regulatory takings are things where the government didn't intend to take your land, but they adopted regulations that were so burdensome that a court decides, in effect, that they've taken your land. And zoning is more, we'll spend a lot of time in zoning, it's on this continuum between you can do anything and I'm going to take your land. Excuse me. And how we navigate that continuum is done by planners. Maybe some of the reading you've done in other classes, do you guys still read the book by the planner who, in New York City during the century, I can't remember his name, Majesty of the Law? You haven't done that reading. There was, at the turn, beginning of the 20th century, the idea of planning our cities became much more prominent. And one of the purposes of planning a city, and that implies control of land. It's all owned by private parties, many, many private parties, but we're going to control it to develop a beautiful city. And that was the first time that an interest in creating beautiful and well-planned cities for their own sake became a factor and led to the adoption of the first zoning laws. So, nuisance law gave way to a need for regulation, and a regulation that would be systematic, that could apply to many different circumstances, not just the particular land use conflict that might give rise to a nuisance case. And so the first zoning regulations were adopted at the beginning of the 20th century. And the power that the government exercised in order to adopt zoning is called the police power. It really has nothing to do with police. It is the power of local government to regulate actions for the benefit of the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. So it's very, very broad. Almost every local government law, almost every state law that you encounter is based on the police power. We require that schools have fire exits. That's to regulate, that's a regulation based on the police power.
Can you repeat again what police power is?
It's the power of the government to regulate actions to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So that's the movement that we went through in the 20th century to get to broadly adopted zoning codes. The first zoning code was probably New York in the early 20th century, and then the first Supreme Court case upholding a general zoning law was Euclid versus Amber Realty. And you'll hear, you'll encounter in your reading references to Euclidean zoning. And that's what it means. It's a reference to that Supreme Court case, Euclid versus Amber Realty. But let's talk more about the theory behind this. This is a quotation that I found interesting. Unless restrained by some external force or internal command, mankind incessantly exploits and ultimately despoils or destroys natural environments. And somewhere in the frenzied pursuit of more material possessions and a higher living standard, it is morally necessary to think about what kind of world will be passed along. That's pretty harsh. We've lived our whole lives in a regulated land development scenario where we have not encountered development that could run this wild. But there was probably a time when tenements were built with no regard to safety, light, access to parks, access to any sort of public benefits, when industrial uses had no environmental controls, and they spewed forth toxins all over neighborhoods. This is the context, that was the world in which this quote, came about. So if developers, if the great industrialists of the last century they could have completely despoiled the way this is described, but zoning and other police power regulation came into play and it restrained that. I think we all benefit from it. And ultimately, if the industrial use is made to develop carefully and the residential use is made to develop well, it enhances both of their values and both win. Will the industrial developer be able to strike, take his money and run? Maybe not. You know, he'll have to develop in a way that extends his investment over time, and I say his, I could be different, but so these are the concepts that underlie the zoning regulations and the comprehensive planning regulations that we're going to be encountering. Should land use decisions be market-based, purely technical, design-focused, structured to serve public policy, or driven by availability of public? So all of these purposes we will encounter in land development regulations that are in effect today. You will go to Miami and encounter Miami 21, and the entire zoning code has become design-focused, okay? Form-based. Uses can be mixed. They're not afraid of that anymore. It's all a matter of the form of the building. In most places in Broward County that are still very suburban-like developments, separation of uses is still there. And mixed use is still a struggle for them. The easiest way they have to keep their communities safe and happy is to separate uses. So you'll encounter all of these purposes.
How well do you understand Miami 21? Because there's so many transportation impacts that are totally ignored by those policies. I mean, like, for example, the Brickell Shopping Center that's being built completely ignored gridlock and congestion problems.
Are you talking about World Center?
No, the other one, the one that's being built by Swire.
Oh, okay. I think that there's a policy, there's a principle behind it, that the old kind of mobility cannot be what drives us anymore in the cities. We have to create pedestrian mobility, we have to create utilization of mass transit, and you can't do that without density. Think of Manhattan. You must have a gravitational pull of adequate residential density to make any of those policies work, to bring the uses to a pedestrian-friendly diameter, to get people to give up their cars and use mass transit. So I think what Miami 21 does, in part, is allow the density and try to make it more livable with a focus on design. But I'm not an expert in Miami 21. Again, if I can get one of my colleagues from our Miami office to come talk to you about Miami 21, I will.
What about Palm Beach County? What kind of environment do you see in Palm Beach?
Well, Palm Beach County has a good downtown, right? They have a pretty dense focus to the development of their downtown, but they are largely suburban, right? They're a bigger county than Broward County. They have a lot more vacant land to develop, and they're still developing in a pretty suburban manner up there with park-like office parks and so on. So but it's such a large county that they can't treat the entire county like an urban area. So they do have a downtown development. Okay, sorry, backtracking. Eminent domain, we talked about this. It's defined as the power of government to take private property for a public use. To take private property for public use. And all of those terms will require definition. What's property? You'll see local government can condemn all of the land interests that we talked about, sky to mineral, or they can excise portions that they want to condemn. They can condemn air rights. They can take an easement. They can condemn an easement only over the surface of the land for some purpose. They can acquire mineral rights. All of these interests that are less than all of the real property can be condemned and taken by government. It needs to be for public use. So what do you think a public use is? Some examples of a public purpose that it's clear the government.
Parks, schools, recreation.
Utilities, roads, yeah. What about, well, let's talk about parks. You don't really need parks to live, do you? I mean,
I think that's just
Something environmental.
It enhances the quality of life of the community
yeah,
and so on.
The environmental things.
It's green space.
it's green space. Does government really have any interest in in parks, and this has all been decided, and yes, they do, but there was a big challenge. This was a long battle. There were eminent domain actions to acquire parks that failed for a number of years, where the government determined that's not a public purpose. It's not like water, sewer, health. So there was a long, extended planning effort to document the way that the availability of parks and green space contributed to health, in order for the taking of land for a park to be upheld as a public purpose. I'm trying to remember back in the last time the airport, Fort Lauderdale Airport, was expanded in the 80s, they acquired land to eliminate noise, to eliminate residential uses from noisy areas. And there was an eminent domain case that the judge refused to issue the initial order to allow the land to be taken because he determined that wasn't a public use. To eliminate, it's like if they want to live in a noisy place, let them. So what is a public use can be debated.
How does this concurrence and movement handle those kinds of issues?
Well, concurrency means that a developer needs to show that the necessary public facilities to serve their development will be available concurrent with the impact of development. That's where the term concurrency comes from. That water, sewer, parks, schools, all of the services needed to serve your 100-unit development will be available concurrent with the impact of development. That's all it means. So if a development approval is rejected because facilities are not available, there's usually many, many ways. You can defer, you can phase the development to defer it. You can look at the plans that the local government has to build those facilities and time your project to come online concurrent with the facilities. You can contribute to accelerate the facilities that are needed for you to be concurrency. So concurrency, when it became the law in Florida, was caused a lot of fear that it would stop development. But in reality, ways have been found to work through the requirement that you have public facilities concurrent with the impact of your development. It hasn't resulted in a taking much. So can you think of an example in which a local government eminent domain action, a decision to take property for public use, would be abusive, would be a stretch?
For highway expansion?
You think for highway portion?
So a while back, they made everybody leave the Everglades so they could flood the Everglades out. It was people that wanted to live out in nature and be on the universe or whatever. And it's kind of like, okay, well, this is where I want to live. But you're taking my house because you want to flood it out or whatever.
Right, okay. So it may be, they could have dealt with the drainage needs some other way.
Yeah.
I know A1 is inclusionary zoning for mixed-income housing, things like that. This kind of thing. It's been approved, but it was a stretch from it.
Yeah, okay, that's a regulatory thing. If you want to build, you must build this. That's a regulatory requirement. If the government wanted to condemn a parcel and build affordable housing, is that a public purpose?
Yes, because affordable housing is necessary for social use.
Okay. What if?
But it depends on who.
Pardon?
Depends on who's in charge. Is the private market or private companies on charge? Is that a public purpose or public use?
If there was no other way to provide housing for low and very low income, it's kind of easy to see it as a public purpose, right? It's the only option. But what if there was already affordable housing existing in the private market in that community, and yet the government, the housing authority, said, well, we want to build it here, so we're going to condemn your land and build public housing here. But it's available in the market. Does that change your evaluation of whether that's an appropriate public purpose?
Yes.
Yes. There's a point at which it becomes you would say, I think they still win that case, but it becomes less of a public purpose, and it's more the government putting its thumb into the public market, into the market-based economy in a way that's not necessary. Because when the government decides to take your land and they're going to pay just valuation, it's not really a market transaction. It affects the market, but they're putting their thumb on the scale. Because there's no way to walk away. When when I'm trying to sell you property and you're considering whether to buy it, if you don't like my price, you walk away. But when you're dealing with a government taking, that's not the case. There's a thumb on the scale. So,
could there be a moral and ethical component to those kinds of decisions?
Sure. Yeah. Think about what if the plan is, I'm going to condemn, we're trying to redevelop our downtown. It's going very nicely, thank you. But there's this little stinky hole of a block. And we can't get it. We haven't been able to get it. So we want to condemn it and hand it over to the private developer that's doing such a nice job with the rest of the downtown. Is that abusive?
Yes.
It's against the law in Florida right now. There was a case.
Not the same case that happened years ago in Del Rey, when they wanted to revamp, ship the whole.
I believe that Del Rey did that. As a community redevelopment agency, they condemned land and handed it over to private developers. On Hollywood Circle, before the law changed, they condemned land and handed it over to private developers for a redevelopment plan. There was Kilo, it was a Kilo case that was it went to the United States Supreme Court. A community redevelopment agency did this. They condemned land and conveyed it to a private developer, and it was challenged. And the Supreme Court determined that they had the authority to do that. The redevelopment of a blighted area was a sufficient public purpose, and there was outrage across the country at that decision. And legislatures, one state after another, changed their eminent domain law to prevent that from happening. And in Florida, our law changed also. Now, land cannot be condemned and then conveyed to a private developer unless it's offered first to be sold back to the person who it was condemned, who was the condemnee. And there are other constraints. So that was the world, the United States cried out in response to the Kilo case and said, no, we don't want this to happen. We don't want someone to be pushed out and replaced with another private developer. You've got to use it for a public purpose, or you can't use it for a public facility, or you can't use it at all. It had a big impact on Community Redevelopment Association planning.
So the just valuation by the government on, let's say, the pig farm, for example, on nuisance cases. At that current time, let's just say it was zoned agricultural and they were allowed to do the pig farm and admit odor without it being a nuisance. But the area got rezoned and residential started popping up. Now that they're claiming nuisance against the property that was currently zoned or previously zoned agricultural uses, how does the government justify that valuation as far as paying a price to eliminate that use on the property, even though they had the initial right to do so?
You know, if there was a nuisance use that couldn't be made acceptable or couldn't be eliminated any other way, the government could condemn it. They could file a suit to eliminate the use, and some appraiser somewhere would have to be found who could value the loss of the use. They could be, but they would, if the land was condemned outright, they would be entitled to compensation for the highest and best use. And that may be the pig farm. I mean, I've been through this with mobile home parks. There are many cities that would love to eliminate all their mobile home parks. Some of them are not that antagonistic because it provides affordable housing in their community, and they need that. But some of them will do almost anything to get rid of mobile home parks. The thing is, mobile home parks generate a lot of cash. the valuation of a mobile home park on an income basis would shock you, because the owner of the mobile home park makes very little investment in capital improvements. The residents own their own homes, but it's a constant cash flow. So for loan purposes, and this is what I've done a lot of analysis for lenders of mobile home parks. I'm like, really? Don't worry about the non-conforming use. You can redevelop into something so much nicer. They don't want to know. They want to know if they can keep the cash flow from the mobile home park in the event of a casualty. So if a use was so noxious that the local government sought to eliminate it through condemnation, they would have to pay value based on highest and best use. It might be the noxious use. It might be some other use, but their appraiser would determine that.
Can you find the value they give you, the appraiser gives you, or can you hire your own appraiser?
Yes. That's always, that's part of it.
Satisfaction of it.
Other states, Florida is very, very protective of landowners in eminent domain, and you are permitted to hire an entire team of appraisers, planners, engineers to assist you with that valuation, and it all gets paid for by the government, and your attorney's fees.
CRAs, they seem to abuse a lot of their rights and privileges. How does that happen? I mean, how do they come about? Where do they get their authority that allows them to, you know, bring about some of the abuses that are very obvious in the Miami area, for example?
Well, you know, do remember that a lot of what you read in the papers that reporters wouldn't write those stories if they weren't inflammatory. So sometimes things are not always what they seem, and I don't have any CRA clients, so I'm not speaking on behalf of any client, but the community redevelopment agencies are created by statute. There is a statute that establishes how they are created. First, a study has to be done to determine if there's a blighted area. There are definitions that come from federal law that govern whether an area is in need of redevelopment and blighted. And then the study has to go on to make a plan for the redevelopment of the area. And the CRA can take a portion of the tax revenue from the area as the area improves in value and reinvest it into the community redevelopment area. So that's, it's less common to finance that, but it's called tax increment financing. So all of the land is worth $10 before the redevelopment starts, and then as they make improvements in the land and the value of the area increases to $20, that increment, the $10 increment, is taken. It's not spread across the entire jurisdiction, but it's put right back into the CRA. And that revenue, if it can be evaluated adequately, can be financed, tax increment bond financing, and they issue bonds on the strength of that revenue stream to advance the money to put in the improvements that are going to continue the redevelopment. That's like a really overly simplistic evaluation of CRAs.
My question would be, do they supplement the government work, or they work for the community? What is the best way of
the CRA is supposed to work for the improvement of the CRA area in accordance with a plan that was adopted when the CRA was created. That's how they're supposed to work.
So like a mini government.
Yep, many times it is the same city commission that governs the entire city. They change hats, they put on their CRA hat, and they are the governing body of the CRA. The county, I mean, most of the cities in Broward County, the city commission serves as the CRA board, also for those who have CRAs. And they do, they get bad press when they spend their money on something that seems unwise, and then the auditors come in and they respond and they constrain, and they stop spending their money on that for a while, and then the auditors and the reporters move on to somebody else, and they go about, you know, life as normal. But there is a statutory structure that they are supposed to operate within. And the premise is they must do a study that concludes that there is a blighted area that would benefit from redevelopment efforts. That's the premise.
So, still interesting. So they pass the law, the city officials, you know, they pass the law, and then they're basically in turn, are part of the CRS to implement or execute the law.
Yes. They assemble a staff, the staff takes the plan, and they start making plans for how they're going to improve it. Sometimes they create grant programs that will assist small businesses to expand or to upgrade their property. They'll create grant programs that give homeowners improvement grants to increase their home values if there are homes within the CRA. So they'll spend their money on the infrastructure. Now that they can't buy the land and give it to a private developer, they will pay for this infrastructure to facilitate the private development. Okay, so I worked on a project in Hallandale where it was a couple of blocks, and it was multifamily with great, you know, it was a nice little project. It had a combination of townhouse units and high-rise units and structured parking and so forth. It was a good project. But it encompassed 2 blocks, and the city wanted the US section of US 1 improved, and they wanted the street that ran between the 2 blocks to be made into something more boulevard-like with street parking. So the CRA took their investment in the project was to do those public street improvements, okay? And that was consistent with the law and how they were permitted to spend their money. And so the private developer did what they did, the private part, and the city did. They took those. They might have been improvements that they would have done someday anyway, but they reorganized them so that they would be done to meet this project, and it made the project feasible and served the purposes of the CRA. Okay, so we've talked about. And then the question, can something be done short of condemnation to prevent those harmful land uses and encourage beneficial uses? And that's what we're talking about for most of the rest of this class, which is land use regulation. Yeah.
So a CRA, is it similar to like a CDD, as far as like capital improvements in the public area?
It is somewhat similar, but it's clearly government, it's clearly public. A CDD has to be approved, a community development district, it's another statute, has to be approved by the local government, but what the CDD ends up being is really the developer. So in a large master plan community, the developer will create a CDD, essentially assess itself to do the infrastructure, but it allows them to finance it and pass it on to the next buyer. So who lives in Weston? Say they live in Weston. Okay, so you're paying, your property is gets assessments for CDDs that funded all of the infrastructure that's out there. It's a financing mechanism that allows a developer they're going to pay those costs anyway, so they pay them until they sell, and then as they sell off, the obligation to continue paying for them goes with the land. It's kind of quasi-judicial, but quasi-governmental. A CRA is much more the government. Okay, so here we talked about this. These are the standards in the constitutional standards that apply to eminent domain. Private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. That's the federal constitution. Our state is a little more protective for public purpose and with full compensation. And believe me, the eminent domain lawyers, they make a big deal out of the difference between just compensation and full compensation. Full compensation in Florida, that term is what's behind our statute that says the government has to pay all of the property owners legal fees, consulting fees, appraisal fees, and all of the standards that really protect the private property being condemned in Florida, which is very protective. It's a developers, it's a state built by developers, what can we say? So that's eminent domain.
I come from Atlanta where there's a lot of suburban sprawl, but as I moved to South Florida in 2000, my first impression is, given the fact that we're landlocked here, and when you have land controls, why do you see so many blighted areas? Why do you see a sea of low-income housing that should be condemned and converted over? For example, there's one of the worst gangs in the nation is up in Palm Beach. You've got just areas that are just so blighted, but why don't they do anything about it?
It's what to do about it is complex, because in those neighborhoods there are bad actors that you're talking about who cause to make the neighborhood as bad as it is, and there are innocent people who have lived there for multiple generations. So if you displace the bad actors through condemnation, condemning a whole neighborhood, you're displacing the innocent residents who just want you to, they don't want you to kick them out of their neighborhood, they want you to fix their neighborhood. And that's the balancing act that is encountered with redevelopment. And sometimes, and maybe Del Rey is one of those examples, you take the big hit, you demolish the neighborhood really and rebuild it to create a leader, to create a point of light in an area, and it starts drawing to it other quality developments and other quality businesses, and it gets rebuilt. Whether the original residents ever get to move back in there, and that's the cost of redevelopment if you're going to do it with that heavy-handed. CRAs tend to find ways to not do that demolition work, to strategically create incentives for high-quality development that are going to raise the whole neighborhood.
Politically correct, right?
Well, politically correct, I mean, there's people behind that term, politically correct. There are people who've raised their kids and their grandkids there, and they want to stay there.
The problem is, where do they go?
Right, and where do they go that they can afford?
Is that the dilemma that is facing now with strong boulevard?
I think that it's been a struggle with someplace like Sistrunk that had a great history as the main street of the African community in Fort Lauderdale, and it's how do you preserve that? How do you support it, redevelop it, re-energize it, and yet allow it to retain the character it's always had?
A way to solve, at least from my experience in New York City, a way to solve areas that are negatively viewed as like low income or dangerous and whatnot. There's been like questioning in New York and like the redevelopment of certain areas of having mixed use income, so that there isn't an identified area that's solely like, oh, they're lower income or they're dangerous, or that's where gang behavior is occurring. So maybe, in the redevelopment, like say for your example, saying if the downtown area, if I wanted to condemn that block, maybe the developer can propose maybe, taking that block, but including those people, but including also other types of people,
Yes, that's the concept behind inclusionary zoning.
But certainly, across the nation, what we're seeing is a percentage of those original residents get to stay. And the generational continuum is not maintained. They can't afford to stay in the area.
No, it is a challenge, and if what you want to happen is that the values of the land improve, then it prices some of those people out, and yet they need to live somewhere. And we've learned that collecting all of the low-income housing in one place and directing it all there it doesn't work. That's how it becomes the housing projects that you see on exposés where no one wants to live safely. So in the redevelopment, trying to include mixed use too, so that people who can't afford cars can still do their business in their own neighborhood and get around as a pedestrian, and including different full market rate housing and some lower income housing into the same community in a way that is sort of invisible. That's the goal. I'm saying it's really hard to do. And from a developer's perspective who wants to build a good project, but then be able to get it fully occupied and sell out to the next one, they're developers, they're not operators, right? They need it to meet those financial goals that will allow them to sell it and move on.
Speaking about New York, what happened in Harlem, I think that's Harlem, New York. So the low-income people were just pushed out. So it has become quite a high-income place.
Gentrification, yes.
So there is basically the mix use or accommodating the residents. So once you talk about redevelopment, so that just push that away.
It can happen. We've seen it all. And I don't have the answers. I don't have the best way. There are elected officials, who struggle with this in a microcosm, and there are bureaucrats in Washington who struggle with this in the macro sense. Because there are a lot of federal programs that create funding for different aspects of the redevelopment project. And it can be difficult for a developer to take advantage of all those and navigate them and not end up in jail, we now know from the Miami story. But so the federal government has their goals, and they adopt regulations and create grant programs to achieve their goals. And then there's a state layer and there's the local layer. Really what the federal government might give you a grant for might not be what the local government wants to see anyway. And so it can be very difficult as a private developer to find a way to redevelop an area in a way that the local government will accept, that makes it a profitable project. And even if you don't want to be the cause of that kind of gentrification, sometimes it's going to happen.
Yeah, and there's also they're seeing cases of social isolation and disconnect. Those who happen to stay, how they feel relative to their new neighbors, having things in common and so forth. I think in New Orleans, what they're doing after Katrina, some new developers, young developers, are having more success with not completely changing the population and allowing more to stay, as opposed to the traditional, just a few percentage.
That would be an interesting story to find out how they do that. What they change about the typical development model that allows them to achieve that. Okay, so we've talked about there's no regulation. The best you can do if you don't like what your neighbor is doing is file a nuisance lawsuit, all the way to something that's so horrible that the government is going to come in and condemn it and eliminate it. And in between, regulatory takings. So if a taking of land means actually taking the land, an inverse condemnation would mean what? Giving it back? That's a good guess. Inverse condemnation is another term for a regulatory taking. So when the government does, regulatory is actually a subset. So when the government does something other than announce that it's going to take your land, but it regulates it, or it trespasses on it, or it flows water through it for a drainage system without asking you, those things, something other than, here, we're filing this lawsuit because we're going to take your land. Here's the notice of hearing for the order of taking. Okay? So anything other than that can be called, and where the government does it sort of backhanded. They impact your land in a way that denies you all economically viable use of the land through regulation or some sort of physical trespass that's not a full, that wasn't done properly with an order of taking. That can be an inverse condemnation. The regulatory taking comes specifically from the effect of regulation. Questions? More questions?
So it could be like a public easement, for example?
If the land, there have been inverse condemnation cases that happen because the government floods your land periodically, and they don't take an easement. They probably should have knocked on the door and said, we'd like to buy an easement from you, but they didn't. They just flood your land. It's a physical invasion, but they didn't go through the process of acquiring the right to physically invade your land periodically. that's one kind of inverse condemnation. Anytime the landowner is affected, but the government did not file the taking lawsuit, they can bring an inverse condemnation action. Anytime the landowner is in the chair of the plaintiff instead of the government, it's an inverse condemnation. A regulatory taking is one kind of those, and it's where you claim that the effect of the regulation is so extreme on your land that it causes you to lose all economically viable use of your land. There are different standards. That's kind of the most generally applicable standard. And it can be these are always difficult cases. They're difficult cases to get in the courthouse door because of pre-lawsuit requirements that the cases conflict, and they're difficult cases to prove and to win. You have to identify what property is affected. Aircraft overflight cases come into this when the flight pattern changes at an airport, and so instead of getting 24 overflights, you're getting 200 overflights a day. That can be the cause of an inverse condemnation case. Is it regulatory? No, because it's caused by physical invasion. But they didn't come knock on your door and ask to buy an air easement from you. Does it make a little bit of sense? Okay. But you have to identify the property that you think is taken. The flooding, you have agricultural land and it only gets flooded twice a year. I don't know, is it taken? It's flooded twice a year for 5 days or something. What property interest has been taken? Those are the things that make these cases difficult. And how much value is lost that's attributable to the action, to the government action. The regulatory taking cases can be very tricky in this way too. Part of the problem is that there are these many layers of regulation. And the city, the zoning authority might say, we didn't cause that loss of property value. The county did when they required that we reduce the density on the barrier island because of hurricane evacuation. And the county says, we didn't cause that loss of value. The Army Corps of Engineers did because they won't let you dredge and fill. And the Army Corps of Engineers says, we didn't cause that loss of value. The South Florida Water Management District did because they changed their environmental resource permitting standards. I know these are all words that don't mean anything to you yet, but that's what makes regulatory taking cases hard. And you want to find a way to work through the existing regulations rather than have to challenge them. But these are the methods that are available. Now, do you remember when I talked about what the underlying governmental authority that gives rise to zoning regulations is called the
Police power?
Police power, and it's the power to regulate actions for the benefit of the public health, safety, and welfare. In the land use context, one basis for one reason that you can challenge a regulation is if it does not actually advance a legitimate governmental interest. So a valid zoning regulation must advance the legitimate governmental purpose of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. But if a land use regulation is adopted that does not advance those interests, it can be challenged as invalid in a regulatory taking case. So I'm thinking of an example. Architectural design standards could fall into this. The first time that a city adopts a color palette, and someone has let's say there was a big deal made back in the 70s when McDonald's tried to go into Coral Springs, which had the most restrictive sign regulations at the time of any place, and they didn't get their golden arches because the sign regulations would not permit them in Coral Springs. But you might challenge something like an aesthetic rule, like a color palette or an architectural standard or the more extreme versions of a sign code as not truly advancing a legitimate governmental purpose. You have that whole park discussion, whether the aesthetic beauty of your city is a legitimate governmental reason for regulation.
Is there some kind of a statutory restriction as to which court or level of courts would have jurisdiction to hear some of these cases?
Yes. Do you really want to know? It's,
Well,
there's a method. There's a method of challenging them in each state. You know, how you get in front of a court on these things, and they differ from state to state. So yes, there is. You need a lawyer. You do.
I got a question. Of these cases, because we're learning a lot about these cases, but of these cases, there's always an appeal usually afterwards, and it takes forever for a developer who's, you know, literally looking at the site and trying to, you know, even a long-term development, 5, 10 years. I mean, you were talking about the Coons case, but I was reading that the guy died before it was ever resolved, and so I mean, if it's just going to get tied up in litigation and continue to get appealed and appealed and appealed, why would a developer? The Kilo case I just looked up, they walked away. The developer said they won the case, but it was too late. They'd already moved on to another site. So from a developer's perspective, it just seems to me once these regulations and things come into control, it's just not even worth continuing to pursue. You might as well just cut your losses and go to another location.
That's often the decision, and yet you have to be able to understand to make that decision. Okay, whether you choose to fight it is a whole different thing, but you have to recognize where the fight's going to be so that you can choose to terminate, walk away, sell the property as it is.
I think sometimes in my company it's like, okay, this project might not be that important, but we want to be in this state or we want to be in this area, so we continue the fight just because it's like, okay, the next project that comes along, we need to be bigger. We need to make sure that the law is there for us.
Yes, that could be true too. And advocates of, you know, private property rights got involved in the Coons case. Not-profits. I don't know if it was Pacific Legal was involved in Coons, but sometimes just like environmental advocates come in and help a property owner to fight an environmental issue, private property rights groups will come in and help property owners fight these regulatory taking cases because they need to change the law. They need to make good law. And a government might do it. They might do it with the support of a private property rights group. But they're going to be the tip of the spear on that issue. Back in 1989, when Broward County had adopted its first comprehensive plan under the new statute, we had challenges from a portion of what's now Southwest Ranches before they became a town, and several challenges, and they were strategically designed on these policy issues. The developers' challenge was backed by the local community of developers, their board that weighed in on legislative issues, and the other challenge, the rural community challenge, was backed by an environmental group. So that's what we litigated those big issues on behalf of individual owners, but the people who were concerned about the big issue were actually behind the litigation, and that happens. That's how cases like Coons get up to the Supreme Court. Regulatory takings.
But it does serve a purpose, you know, and it's just trying to make sure we don't throw out the baby with the bath water. Because in that case where the land, this landholder had a parcel of land, it was divided into 3 different zones. And I could see legitimately you might lose on one end, but higher use and value from the other parts being zoned up, as it were. But at the same time, overall, how the city or the area develops does impact the whole community.
Right, and it's just like those old nuisance cases, okay? They illustrated why we needed comprehensive land use regulation. The modern regulatory takings case, it has the same failings. It's a particular piece of property under a particular set of circumstances, and it ends up driving policy. That's not the best way to make policy. it's best to come together, to bring the stakeholders together, to evaluate the needs of the community, to do something that's reasonable and broad-based. If we didn't have the threat of that litigation, then government would have all the power, and there would be no incentive on their part to build consensus. But that check is built into our system, right? So government knows that if they don't collaborate with the community, if they are not reasonable, they could be sued, they could lose, and the outcome could be worse, and they could spend all that money. And in the meantime, that tax base would not have been created because the developer would give up, die, go away. So the existence of the regulatory taking case, it forces the government to the table to be reasonable, to act in a collaborative way, and that's how we come up with regulations that you don't have to sue over, because you can find a way to work within them. If you look at them and you look at the plans that underlie them, you can see that they've got a point, you know? The city of Fort Lauderdale, it was, would have all these regulations that required they would increase the setbacks. So you wanted to assemble land and vacate the streets in between them to create a bigger parcel of land so you could build to satisfy their setbacks. But they started realizing they didn't want to lose that granulated city grid that they had. So they started backing off on the setbacks that were forcing people into that kind of large land assemblage. So they started pushing back on the ability to vacate the land, the roads, and they started allowing more yard waivers that would allow you to build the way they wanted to in this granulated way. Does that illustrate it for you that they couldn't have it both ways? They couldn't have huge yards and small blocks. You know, it just physically wasn't going to work. So they were forced to find a way to accommodate that. They didn't want vast areas of old strip malls to sit vacant because their parking standards were so high that no one could ever reuse it. So they started working in sections of the city to change the parking to allow reuse of those buildings to occur. These standards, these outlying limitations on what government can do, you don't sue them very often, you don't challenge them very often, you might not win very often, but they force the government to be more reasonable in their role as a regulator. Okay, enough of my voice for a while. We've got a while until lunch. Let's break up into, have you all got your teams set for the case study by now? All right, so let's just walk through the room and tell me who's in your team. I won't remember, but let me visually see who's who, and then I want someone with a computer to start searching for the site that you want to use for your case study, and I'll be available to walk around with you and look at it and help you identify the site that you want to work on. Okay, first team over here. You have your, no team yet. Next. You three, okay.
3 of us. Yeah.
3, who? Okay.
It's me, Tyler, and Ryan, he's missing today.
He's what?
He's missing Ryan Comfort, he's missing, but we're not
Okay.
Ryan.
All right. Are you going to team it? No, Tyler? Teams?
Team this.
You 3?
You want to be on our team?
Y'all on my today? I'm sorry? West Palm.
You're not on West Palm?
Okay. You guys are, you 3?
Lottie-dottie.
3? 3? You guys got a team? I can move it. So far you need There's a team of 2. You want a third? Somebody here locally?
No, all right, I got a team.
You've got a team? There's a team of 2 that wants to work on something locally on your team. Okay, you got Paul. You guys, Paul?
Paul Junction.
Who's still got running? You got just the 2 of you?
No. Yeah, we're doing us 3.
Oh, okay, you're on that.
Where do you need? Fort Lauderdale. That's fine.
What do y'all think?
Okay, so shift around, so you're sitting together and start talking about the site that Okay, and I would appreciate if one of you guys decide one of you that's going to email me stuff. Okay, so one of you on the team is going to be the one to communicate with me, just so that obviously I become kind of seasoned.
But when you're approaching South Beach, you got the flyover, you got the hospital,
right after.
He's the one who's got that was a good craft.
Haven't even seen it yet.
Well, the assignment is, yes, it needs to have a change that's gone through its final, no, not just final. It doesn't have to be final, yes, it does not have
Go there, be there, something else. Okay, take
Yeah.
Sometimes they have links to sometimes we all like planning
at the agenda over the past year. They call it Project 15-304. They call it so it's
That's where I'm at.
you can call it and some of them are real, you know, again, they didn't do this kind of thing. They were in high school and they
economic development.
It tends to go through like what's called the development board committee or something, probably they call it technical. There's a staff level review, there's an advisory board that's usually a development board or committee, and then some of them get well there, some of them go on yeah, and economic development board might be a red area. It's not really part of the process. It's just to decide that and if you can look for, sometimes they have a link to PDFs to have
I don't have to but did I read this book and it was like, why don't you have to use it? It was like, what it like, that's so true. My great
okay. But is it, has it achieved? You have to find out if they have to at least go for rezoning or now, but it hasn't happened. They don't have one.
Yeah,
The shops that
one of the steps I want you to do is look at a project that's already achieved its final and you can analyze. If it's not going to have time period to work it. I want you to get to let me have your attention for a minute, because I'm hearing some similar things. Okay, so let me have your attention for a minute. So you're focusing on finding a jurisdiction that you want to work in where you're going to look for a project. And you go first to the website for the city or the county or the local government jurisdiction where you're looking for your project. You go to their planning department or something that sounds like a planning department, walks like a planning department. Another source, some of you will know about this, there's most, especially in South Florida, most of the local governments have their zoning codes online through either the Municipal Code Corporation or American Legal Publishers. Okay, so it's municode.com, MUNICODE.com, or amlegal, amlegal.com. And then there's a few other code publishing houses, but most of them in Florida are there. Most of the planning department websites that you're finding will have links directly to their code. But in case they don't, or it's not obvious, you'll find their regulations usually at municode.com or amlegal. And I think in Broward only Pompano and Hollywood are on amlegal, and the rest of them are on Municode. So that's where you'll start looking for regulations. And again, if it's not clear to you what the process is, sometimes you'll find a lot more information than you want, but you can go to the code itself that will describe the development approval process. Okay, commence. As long as it's been yes, our team in Land Dave is clearly the ACU we're in 333. We're in the the old building was down by. I call it the mothership. I'm based in Ohio. I don't get to Miami all day long. Okay. How's it going? Any questions?
That's a good idea.
You know, there's, you want to be what county?
Oh, wait, I
Because you're first.
But that one has like a small water. It has like a site for
They're trying to exchange property.
Yeah. The fire station.
They have one thing I
All day.
Oh wait, what about the public shower? Yeah, and that one, what is that, like
Are you guys like so ahead of this?
Yeah.
Are you guys, is it project that you're doing today?
No, but it might be. We're going through
There's super yachts.
That's what I'm asking for. This guy is more complicated than that.
just call on somebody they know. I fired an associate because all he would ever do is call up the shop and ask a question. And I never worked on projects. All right, so no,
Well, the key is, that's what I was asking, is there anyone on your way to the beach? So I figured, go away.
If you tell me that the land use is this and the zoning is this.
Right, that goes back to what is the process? Oh, I don't want to get into details in that regard. I never bothered about all that stuff. That's like a certain, that's like, I don't even, I probably can't in terms of just figuring out what's going on in the county. And just figure out where we're starting from. And then from there, we'll go on. But, it's plagiarism on a whole other level.
Did you ever work with the Yeah, he did a lot of work